Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the deep historical and legal realities behind those little documents we carry around in our pockets every single day. We're going to unpack a really fascinating source text from Islamic civilization that examines the classical rules of war and peace and how they apply directly to modern citizenship and residency visas. And just a quick note as we start, since we are analyzing classical religious texts, you'll notice our visual focus today is strictly on the texts, concepts, and documents, honoring the traditional avoidance of drawings of people in the specific context. So, is a travel visa a religious treaty? I know, it sounds like a totally surprising question, right? Because, let's be honest, most of us just view a passport or a visa as a bureaucratic headache. It's just a piece of paper or a stamp that lets us cross a border. But to truly understand the rules of war and peace in classical Islamic law, we have to bridge this gap between mundane travel documents and profound religious obligations. According to the text we're examining today, that little stamp in your passport actually carries an immense theological weight.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be looking at 1. The Modern Security Covenant. 2. Defining Al-Amān. 3. Visas are binding contracts. 4. The rule of custom. 5. Extremism and broken oaths. And finally, 6. No obedience in treachery.
Let's start with Section 1, the Modern Security Covenant. It's really easy to assume that ancient religious texts have absolutely zero connection to a 21st century immigration system, but the source material shows a direct, literal parallel. What's fascinating here is how contemporary scholars equate the ancient safe conduct system directly to our modern passports and visas. When you look at classical terms like Al-Amān, which we'll define in just a second, or muwadah, which means a treaty, they map perfectly onto modern visas, passports, and citizenship. Scholar Ahmed al-Dawoodi points out that this ancient system functions exactly like a visa. It's a temporary, renewable permission to stay in a foreign country. In the eyes of Islamic jurisprudence, they are practically one and the same.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining Al-Amān.
To really grasp the legal weight of all this, we need to properly define our core term. We keep saying Al-Amān, but what does it actually entail? Well, it literally translates to protection or safety. And the crucial takeaway here is that Al-Amān isn't just a polite suggestion or a guideline. It is a formal, binding security covenant. It forms an essential, foundational part of the Islamic law of war. Muslims are strictly commanded by their faith to fulfill these contracts.
This perfectly illustrates the classical legal consensus. The 14th century scholar al-Babarti states that Al-Amān is a cause for the absolute cessation of fighting. Granting or receiving this protection legally mandates peace. It acts exactly like a formal state treaty. So, to put it bluntly, the second you accept a visa, you have signed a peace treaty. Which brings us to Section 3. Visas are binding contracts.
All the major Islamic schools of thought are in total agreement on this, and the historical texts are incredibly vivid. When a Muslim enters non-Muslim lands, which historically was referred to in jurisprudence as Dar al-Harb, under this covenant of Amān, they are contractually bound to be peaceful residents. Look at what the 17th century scholar al-Haskafi explicitly outlines. He says one cannot kill, loot, or commit crimes against the host population. Why? Because in his exact words, Muslims stand by their contract. It's absolutely non-negotiable. Furthermore, this protection is entirely mutual. The 13th century scholar Ibn Qudama notes that if a merchant travels to foreign lands, he is under the host's protection. And crucially, the host is under his protection. It's a two-way street. The traveler is legally guaranteed safety from the host, and the host is absolutely guaranteed safety from the traveler. All right, Section 4, the rule of custom. Now, you might be wondering, and it's a great question, what if you never actually signed a document? What if you didn't go to a consulate and swear an oath, but you were simply born in a country? Does this all still apply? Well, the sources tell us that whether you're a natural-born citizen, a naturalized citizen who took an oath, or just someone holding a short-term visa, Islamic law views every single one of these as legally binding agreements. There's literally no contractual difference in the eyes of the law. But how does that actually work for a natural-born citizen who never physically signed anything? It all comes down to a foundational legal maxim regarding custom known as earth. The maxim states, what is known by custom is like what is stipulated by a condition. In simpler terms, unwritten societal customs, like the implied laws and peaceful expectations of being a citizen born in a country, hold the exact same legal weight as written signed conditions.
And the religious obligation to follow these conditions, whether they're written on a visa or just implied by societal custom, is cemented directly by the traditions of the prophet. The only exception is if a condition forces someone to do something explicitly forbidden by the faith or forbids something mandatory. Otherwise, the covenant of peaceful citizenship is completely ironclad. Let's move to Section 5, Extremism and Broken Oaths. This brings us to a critical pivot in our explainer. If classical Islamic law so strictly enforces the peace treaty of a visa or citizenship, how on earth do modern extremist groups justify their actions? In a fascinating twist documented in our source, even former senior Al-Qaeda figures admitted on record that attacking a host country fundamentally violates the religious treaty of the visa. Mahavo's old al-Walid, who was a former member of al-Qaeda's Shura Council, explicitly stated that because the 9/11 hijackers used entrance visas, they breached a binding treaty of protection. This actually created a massive internal fracture within these groups. You had figures like Dr. Fadl and al-Walid who viewed the visas as binding Amān, rendering those attacks religiously unlawful. But then leaders like bin Laden and al-Zawahiri tried to argue that visas or citizenship by birth just didn't constitute a sworn oath. While their interpretations obviously clashed, the source points out that this intense debate proves just how seriously the underlying obligation to honor a covenant is taken, even among those who completely disagree on how it applies. Finally, Section 6, No Obedience in Treachery.
This section directly addresses the demands made by modern extremist leaders when they try to override these civic bonds. When groups like ISIS declared a caliphate in 2014, their leader al-Baghdadi issued a notorious order. He commanded followers to attack in their home countries wherever they might be, and he specifically told them not to consult scholars. He was actively attempting to override the civic covenants of Amān that Muslims held in their respective countries.
And this poses the ultimate dilemma for us as we examine these texts. Does a political or religious leader, even one claiming a massive title like caliph, have the actual authority to order you to break your Amān, your citizenship, or your visa treaty? The classical texts answer this definitively, pointing right back to a core tradition. No obedience is owed to any leader, be it a military commander, a corporate boss, or a caliph, if they order treachery or sin. If an order involves corruption, unlawful killing, or breaking a sacred covenant, your obligation to obey completely evaporates. Classical scholars clarify that a caliph is simply an executor of the law with limited powers. They aren't a deity with absolute authority over people's actions. The defense of "I was just following orders" is completely rejected in Islamic jurisprudence if those orders are corrupt. Actually, our source parallels this to the Nuremberg trials in Western justice, where the idea that an individual isn't responsible for their actions because they were just following orders was firmly legally struck down. Therefore, contemporary scholars explicitly state that following orders of treachery from extremist leaders is not just legally void, it is actively sinful. Scholar Muhammad al-Yaqubi makes it crystal clear: maintaining allegiance to a leader who orders the breaking of these sacred civic covenants is a major sin. So I want to leave you with this provocative thought. Far from being incompatible with modern society, these classical texts actually mandate the protection and sanctity of your passport and your citizenship. If the highest expression of these historical laws is the absolute, unbroken honoring of a residency contract, how does that reshape the way we understand the civic bonds we all share today? It completely reframes the conversation, doesn't it? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep questioning the profound history behind the everyday things we take for granted.